what China is doing now is trying to not only intimidate, but it is trying to ensure that the Philippines' limited resources in terms of its ships would be completely driven out, where China would want to obviously occupy this area illegally once again. But the Philippine Coast Guard, despite its limitations, despite the challenges, has been persistent in maintaining that physical presence.
We're discussing China's continuing and dangerous escalation in the West Philippine Sea. This is Strat News Global. I'm Amitabh Revi. Joining us from Manila is Don McLain Gill. He's a geopolitical analyst, an academician, and a co-editor, co-author. Thanks, Don, for giving us time.
Thank you very much, Amitabh. It's a true pleasure to be here.
Pleasure is always ours, Don. Lots been happening in your neck of the woods. If you could just explain to our viewers this latest escalation by China in terms of the incident I'm talking about is the collision between the Chinese Coast Guard vessel and the Philippines Coast Guard vessel. What's the issue? How far is it from the Philippines coast? Isn't it in the EEZ? How far is it from the Chinese mainland?
Right, thank you. So since August in particular, the Chinese Coast Guard has managed to fully open up an additional front for its illicit and expansionist activities in the West Philippine Sea. So this burgeoning hotspot is centered on the Sabina Shoal, or what we call the Escoda Shoal. So this particular shoal is within Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone. The Philippines has sovereign rights over this particular area. And on top of that, it is also quite close to the energy-rich Reed Bank, or what we call the Recto Bank. And it also serves as a meeting point for resupply missions to the BRP Sierra Madre in the Ayungin Shoal or the Second Thomas Shoal. So aside from its geography and its geopolitical significance, this was illustrated particularly, the significance of the shoal in China's strategic calculations were quite visible, particularly when China was alleged to possess, or at least to undertake, illegal reclamation activities on the said shoal. So there were clear visuals on crushed corals that were dumped into the area earlier on this year. And additionally, Chinese researchers were also found close by. So, based on UNCLOS, foreign actors that seek to conduct marine scientific research in a coastal country's EEZ must seek prior authorization, right? So recognizing the trends and the behavior of China's expansionist ambitions within the West Philippine Sea, particularly since it has been occupying key features illegally since the 1990s, the Philippine Coast Guard was quick to act by sending its largest ship, the BRP Teresa Magbanwa, to the Sabina Shoal since April. So it has been there since April. So that has dampened really China's ambition to conduct these reclamation activities within the Philippine EEZ in a way that would be unnoticed. So it tried to do so discreetly, but that didn't really work out for China. But China was clearly frustrated with what the Philippine Coast Guard has done. It thought that it would be another Scarborough Shoal 2.0 when China was able to occupy the Scarborough Shoal in 2012, and up to this day continues to possess its illicit de facto control at the expense of Philippine sovereign rights. So in this regard, the Chinese Coast Guard sent its largest Coast Guard vessel. They call it the Monster for some reason, and it has been on a standoff against the BRP Teresa Magbanwa. But interestingly, and I'll get to the last point of this, very interestingly, the escalation, the more physical, direct provocations by the Chinese Coast Guard against Philippine ships along or around the Sabina Shoal took place in the month of August, throughout the month of August. So August 19, CCG ships hit 2 PCG ships, or the Philippine Coast Guard ships, traversing through the Escoda Shoal, and that led to significant structural damages. On the 25th, a CCG ship deliberately rammed another government ship of the Philippines, the BRP Datu Sanday. It's under the Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources. So it's a government ship within the area as well. Only 10 nautical miles from the Sabina Shoal. It was on a humanitarian mission, and unfortunately, it suffered engine failure. More recently, on the 26th of August, six CCG ships, along with three PLAN warships, and of course, over 20 vessels of the maritime militia were deployed to surround and swarm the area and serve as a block for resupply humanitarian missions to the BRP Teresa Magbanwa, which is unfortunately now facing scarcity in resources. So China has been trying to block these resupply missions. And the most recent one would be just 2 days ago, the 31st of August, when CCG ships rammed the BRP Teresa Magbanwa thrice, leading to structural damages. So what China is doing now is trying to not only intimidate, but it is trying to ensure that the Philippines' limited resources in terms of its ships would be completely driven out, where China would want to obviously occupy this area illegally once again. But the Philippine Coast Guard, despite its limitations, despite the challenges, has been persistent in maintaining that physical presence. But if China continues to cut off, the supplies for the BRP Teresa Magbanwa, for instance, that could be a challenge in the long run.
Don, you're talking about so many incidents in August itself, all at sea, but there was another incident of dangerous escalation in the air when flares were fired or released very close to a Philippines aircraft.
Right, exactly. And this particular challenge took place twice within this particular time frame, and the escalations taking place at the Escoda Shoal. So Chinese jets were posing a significant challenge to Philippine patrol aircrafts. And it has not only shot flares, but it has acted in a very provocative, dangerous manner, very irresponsible manner. That is not based on how these aircrafts of China should have acted based on international law. And that in itself is, again, another indication of Beijing's willingness to continue escalating tensions in the greater West Philippine Sea, particularly after the July 21 provisional arrangement between China and the Philippines regarding the resupply missions for the Ayungin Shoal, or the second Thomas Shoal. So while China may be relatively constrained in that part of the West Philippine Sea, it has shown that it was more than willing to make up for its strategic losses there and pursue its expansionist ambitions and project more power in other parts of the West Philippine Sea. So that is something that we have been seeing since the signing, or since the announcement of that provisional agreement on July 21.
You are talking about how challenging it could be if China continues its aggressive behavior. So, what is and can the Philippines do to deter the Chinese? It seems like they continue to follow this escalatory pattern without reaching that threshold of firing a shot.
Right. Well, the thing is that China has enjoyed exploiting the inconsistencies in a number of countries' foreign policies towards securing the greater South China Sea in general and the West Philippine Sea in particular. So, aside from the level of consistency that needs to be applied, of course, it is seen that the Philippines would need to employ a more physical level of deterrence against Chinese belligerence and expansionism. So this is where I believe particularly the United States and Japan would be of great significance to the Philippines, given that the Chinese have actually been provoking Japan within its airspace, within its territorial sea, for instance, recently as well. So as we can see that it is a collective intent of China, and particularly as Japan is transitioning towards a new leadership in Tokyo. China is trying to ensure that it would intimidate Japan as much as possible. So this is a wake-up call, particularly for Japan and the Philippines, and to an extent the United States, on the need to have a more concerted level of naval response against Chinese belligerence again. But this would require a lot of coordination, a lot of planning as well. But on top of that, the Philippines must also become steadfast in ensuring, that its military modernization continues. And given, of course, the inadequacy of particular resources, the need to really try to proactively navigate through these would be of great interest and importance to Manila, particularly for the long term. There is no one single solution that could really address the protracted level of Chinese expansionism in the West Philippine Sea, given that it had such an important free run, such a critical free run, for the past decades. And it is important now to make sure that the Philippines, along with its ally and partners, are able to rally up the right amount of cost and impose it on China and its activities in the West Philippine Sea. So this would require a concerted effort, really, to ensure that China's provocations are not going to be considered by Beijing to be something that it could easily get away with. And this has always been the problem in the beginning. But the fact that Beijing agreed to, or at least announced, a provisional arrangement at the for the Ayungin Shoal, for instance, shows you that China is a calculative power. As much as possible, it would not want to incur strategic risks from direct military confrontation, especially at that time when the United States voiced its readiness, its willingness to escort Philippine ships, Philippine resupply ships to the BRP Sierra Madre. But it's just important to note that the Philippines declined that particular position because the Philippines would still want to maximize as much effort as it can achieve on its own without the direct involvement of its ally and other partners. So it's this particular dilemma that we are facing right now.
We'll discuss the last point that you made in a little bit of depth, but since you mentioned the US and in recent days or weeks, the NSA, the US NSA was in China. He met Xi Jinping. He met a senior leader of the CMC, voiced in a press conference support for the Philippines again. So that concerted effort that you're talking about with the Philippines and its allies, whether it's the US, whether it's Japan, it seems like what's happening is the words are there, rhetoric is there, but yeah, you did mention the last point, which I'll get into a bit. But is it enough, just those words?
No, no, absolutely not. And this is why I've mentioned initially that there needs to be more concerted efforts for physical deterrence, right? So China reacts more to physical deterrence rather than anything else. And I've always talked about this. There's so much we could learn for us here in the Philippines regarding what took place in Eastern Ladakh, actually. And there's a lot of convergence that we can see there. Now, the reason why China opted for de-escalation at the Pangong So, for instance, was when the Indian military, the Indian army, were able to occupy the advantageous areas in that particular point, and which led the Chinese to have a vulnerable position. And that in itself catalyzed the call for de-escalation from Beijing louder than ever. But unfortunately, China now has been seen to put on a deadlock with negotiations with India regarding a more wider level of de-escalation. So that shows you that that level of risk was reciprocated by China towards de-escalatory arrangements. But it's never about trust. It's never about having a more conducive atmosphere, a conducive environment with its neighbor. But it's all about risk perception. Now, the reason why China also did that on July 21 was because of the amounting risk perception. Now, if we do not get to apply that level of risk with what China is doing, particularly in the Sabina Shoal, for instance, I believe that it would be counterproductive as part of the Philippines, and China would continue to exploit that particular vacuum. So that is a challenge that we have now. Is that there have been calls in Manila for perhaps we could expand the arrangement. Not just in the Ayungin Shoal, but also other parts of the West Philippine Sea. But we have to understand, as I mentioned, that will be practical if the other party is determined to have a more conducive environment for bilateral relations. But that's not China's interest. China's interest primarily is to pursue its expansionist ambitions. So it all leads to laying the cost on China with more physical deterrence. So I believe that that is something that we need to work on.
Just going back to the point you made in the last to last answer, I just want to play out a couple of sound bites, Don. We listen to them and then get into it in a little more depth. These are of the Indo-Pac uh, command commander, Admiral Samuel Paparo, and General Romeo Browner, who is the Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces of Philippines. You just play that out and then get to talk about it, Don.
Right.
I mean, certainly within the context of consultations, every option between the two sovereign nations in terms of our mutual defense, escort of one vessel to the other is an entirely reasonable option within our mutual defense treaty among this close alliance between the two of us.
Well, definitely we will continue our patrols in the West Philippine Sea. No, not just the maritime sea patrols, but also our air patrols, because it is our obligation. It is our job to do that.
You were mentioning that the Philippines had politely said no, possibly, to escorting of ships if it could, de-escalate or deter China on its own. But what is the position? I mean, if the mutual defense treaty is not triggered unless there are shots fired, then if Philippines agrees to U.S. ships escorting its ships in those contentious areas, is that a way of calling China's bluff, what you were saying, in showing physically deterring, or is that possibly another dangerous escalatory step?
Well, no, I believe what the Philippines is trying to do now is trying to show that, from what we are doing right now, that it is important to still maximize whatever we can do as obviously a sovereign independent country that seeks to pursue things on its own terms. So it has been trying to maximize more options in this regard, but that does not mean that it would stop working with the United States, for instance, in facilitating robust exercises in the area or capacity building, which would help Philippine resupply missions, and of course that level of active deterrence, which the Philippines and the United States are constantly exploring. So that just means that this polite decision by the military of the Philippines is, of course, viewed as a way that the Philippines seeks to pursue a more Philippine-centric approach towards these activities taking place within the West Philippine Sea. But at the same time, it still leaves a room open for possibilities if much of the options have been maximized. So that's my reading of it. But on the other hand, you talked about the mutual defense treaty, but we have to understand what are the elements of the mutual defense treaty. At the end of the day, it's not pretty much like an on and off switch that you switch it on and the military is there, etc. So if we look into the wordings of the mutual defense treaty, it centers on consultancy, right? So it's a process for consultation for the two allies to eventually take the step forward based on a shared, or at least if one party feels that it is being critically targeted in an armed attack. And of course, if we look into the definitions, the Indo-PACOM also released a particular draft that talks about non-kinetic and kinetic attacks as well. So that really tries to provide more nuance to this to the terminologies. But at the end of the day, it needs to be done through the Foreign Ministers' Council from both sides, to lift this up into a consultative process and eventually take this up as to what can be done to address a particular issue that needs to be addressed with utmost concern. So I believe that the steps are being laid down in terms of contingencies based on what is taking place. But for the meanwhile, the Philippines does not want to right away utilize the escort options that are given to it, as it still feels that it can still do much on its own, particularly for these resupply missions. But of course, I believe that Manila would be pragmatic enough to understand how the situation would go as the structural challenges continue to escalate. So this is why the Philippines continues to say that we'll keep the option open. we'll keep the option open when we feel that we have maximized our approaches that we could do on our own. So I believe that the consultations on such contingencies are ongoing. I believe so.
What about other countries in the region? I mean, they all have their beef with China. I'm not getting into the intra-ASEAN territorial disputes or maritime territorial disputes as of now, but say things like Vietnam and the Philippines signing defense agreements, Vietnam and the Philippines Coast Guards, which you mentioned again earlier, having joint exercises. So it's bilateral, it's multilateral with the US, with Japan as well, trilateral. Uh, excuse me, are they all parts of the larger concerted effort that the Philippines should be doing in your view, and are they helping?
Well, definitely. I think the Philippines is now positioning itself to operationalize a more robust multi-alignment approach in terms of its defense partnerships to address its concerns in the West Philippine Sea. And you've talked about Vietnam, and the development with Vietnam is in fact very important. So this is the first time, for instance, that two claimant countries in the South China Sea dispute, the Greater South China Sea dispute, engaged in joint exercises, joint maritime exercises. And the Philippines would also be sending the Philippine Coast Guard would also be sending its ships to Vietnam by the end of the year, for more exercises. And recently, a few days ago, the defense minister of Vietnam was in Manila and signed letters of intent with our national defense secretary, Gilberto Teodoro, for the possibility of forging an MOU on defense cooperation and establishing hotlines between the Vietnamese Coast Guard and the Philippine Coast Guard. And this is unprecedented. I'm giving much emphasis to the Philippine-Vietnam aspect because it's very important. And I believe that it is a defining moment a possibly defining moment in the long-term geopolitics of the South China Sea, particularly since President Marcos Jr. initially highlighted that there needs to be efforts from ASEAN countries, particularly, to craft their own code of conduct, right? And this is well in line with the declaration on the conduct of parties on the South China Sea in the early 2000s. So if the Philippines and Vietnam are able to enhance their confidence building measures and interoperability exercises, for instance, to a point where they could at least establish a basic form of bilateral code of conduct regarding their overlapping maritime claims and eventually paved the way for its resolution, similar to what Vietnam and Indonesia did in December 2022. This would be groundbreaking because this would really provoke Beijing's divide and conquer salami slicing strategy in the South China Sea. I mean, it has thrived so much in a fragmented Southeast Asian approach, along with the lack of interference or the lack of engagement of extra-regional powers. So this in itself, if continued, would be very important. And this also aligns with what the Philippines is doing with its extra-regional partners beyond Southeast Asia. So it's a bit of a mix of different sorts of alignments with different sorts of short-term to mid-term goals eventually. But at the same time, they all overlap and intersect on one, ensuring that the West Philippine Sea is free, open, and rules-based. Two, to enhance the capabilities of the Philippines, and of course to contribute to ensuring that the Philippines plays an active role as a fulcrum for cooperation between several different kinds of states in ensuring that the maritime domain of the Western Pacific and the Indo-Pacific are in line with international law. So these are, of course, long-term efforts that would require consistency. So we hope that this level of momentum would continue even when it comes to the next president of the Philippines 4 years after.
Since you're mentioning the president, President Bongbong Marcos Jr.'s visit 2023, I think, to Beijing, where he met Xi Jinping and excuse me, other leaders. You mentioned also the provisional agreement for ROR or resupplying. What are his policy options in terms of domestic compulsions and the need to deter China, especially in view of you were talking about the next president, but in view of the last president, Duterte's deals with China?
Right. So, public opinion is very important when it comes to democratic countries pursuing particular positions of high security, particularly of the maritime kind, right? And under President Marcos Jr., the level of public support for the Marcos administration's West Philippine Sea approach continues to strengthen. It has been relatively positive all throughout. And this is because I believe that through the Transparency Initiative, which is an element in Manila's overarching approach towards securing the West Philippine Sea, it has been able to solidify that level of convergence between public interests and what the government is doing. And that ensures stability in such instances where there is more understanding of what the government is doing to preserve the sovereignty and sovereign rights of the Philippines, for instance. So this is important, right? So this is important. And that has been an important factor in President Marcos Jr.'s overarching West Philippine Sea approach, right? Is to ensure that the public opinion remains relatively strong and positive and supportive based on what they understand of what's taking place in the West Philippine Sea. But of course, the challenges remain. There has to be a level of consistency, of course, in messaging, right? And that is something that the current administration is trying to strengthen further, to ensure that strategic communication is consistent and all throughout, given the large number or the large percentage of information operations and disinformation campaigns that really spearhead a pro-China propaganda against sovereignty, sovereign rights, and interests of the Philippines. So the Philippines' position on the West Philippine Sea is being addressed based on two fronts, internally and externally as well. So that is a challenge, right? But at the same time, we see it as an opportunity to bring in the discussion towards civil society as well. And that is, in fact, quite commendable.
Now, the Chinese reacted very strongly to the US placing, even if temporarily, its Typhoon missile system in the Philippines. India has its own Act East policy. The Prime Minister will be in Singapore, Brunei. But apart from that, a path-breaking landmark agreement deal that we've talked about many times on this platform, and I'm sure you've written and talked about it elsewhere as well, is the BrahMos missile system, which is coast-based, but a coastal coast guard defense system. How crucial are missile systems like that in deterring the Chinese aggression?
Well, definitely such a missiles which are not only very efficient and also very formidable, but at the same time practical when it comes to the cost. These types of systems are very much important and very convergent with what the Philippine military modernization is all about. Ensuring more practical acquisitions that would get the job done with less financial cost. So I think that the BrahMos acquisition is in fact very important in this regard. And I believe that in terms of the Philippines and India, that there would be a continuous momentum, towards more enhanced defense cooperation. And I believe as we speak, negotiations are being done for an overarching framework for defense cooperation between both sides. So once it may be released or once it is concluded, this would be an important foundation for stronger and more robust defense partnership between Manila and Delhi. So that in itself provides the Philippines with options, and the Philippine Modernization Program is also centered on diversification based on the capacity and the needs of particularly the Philippine Coast Guard and the Philippine Navy. And given that the Philippine Coast Guard is at the front lines of the West Philippine Sea against Chinese belligerence and expansionism, there needs to be that level of proactivity in line with that. So I believe that the Philippines is now opening up bids for multi-role jets, fighter jets. So I believe that India is also placed in its bid in the whole discussion. So it is we are to see where that would eventually lead to. But definitely we can see that the Philippines is serious about ensuring a more practical level of military acquisition that may eventually, that will eventually, complement what the country is trying to do, what the military is trying to do in securing the West Philippine Sea. So yeah, so that's one thing. But again, the challenge here is to ensure that these acquisitions would be integrated with one another, right? That's a long-term goal, to ensure that these systems are integrated into one neat strategy that would really help the Philippines operationalize what it is trying to do. And I think the biggest model for that would be the comprehensive archipelagic defense concept, which was recently released by the Philippines and is being implemented by the Philippine military. So this is, I believe, one important blueprint for such acquisitions. And in this regard, I believe that that India would play a vital role, especially as the partnership is gaining so much momentum to the point where Manila openly includes India into its security calculations today, which was not seen 2 decades ago, or at least more than a decade ago. And this is, in fact, very significant. It's something that I have been personally working on for the past while as well. And seeing this level of development in bilateral ties between two democracies is definitely important.
Don McLain Gill, as usual, it's always very interesting having chats like this with you. Thank you again for all your time and your analysis.
Thank you very much, Amitabh. Thank you.
And for all our viewers, do follow our social media handles for the latest, the articles that we put up on our website, or interviews like this with Don that we put up on our YouTube channel. This is Strat News Global. You've been watching The Gist with Amitabh Revi.